Hey, what is up, everybody? This is Stevie Breach coming to you tonight as we're talking all about the WWE's, I guess you can say WWE Network's, Ric Flair sitting down with Stone Cold Steve Austin discussion on the Stone Cold podcast found only on the WWE Network. This was an awesome show. I know that I've talked about that Ric Flair had done Stone Cold Steve Austin's podcast, and yeah, it's been a while, but if you do remember the podcast that was probably 2 years ago, maybe even longer, on the Stone Cold podcast that you can find on iTunes through Podcast One, a lot of the stories match up. They talk about the plane crash, they talk about family life, but the way you get to see Austin and Flair sit down in the same room. There they are at the Broken Skull Ranch. Ric Flair talks about the fact that, he had a driver from WWE trying to get him from the airport to Stone Cold Steve Austin's ranch, which he says is 100 miles in the middle of nowhere. Stone Cold Steve Austin talks about the fact that, you have to drive an hour just to get to a local grocery store. If you forget the gallon of milk, you're going to go a week without milk because you're not going to want to drive all the way back out to the grocery store just to pick up that gallon of milk. So when you go out, you make sure you go out. Stone Cold Steve Austin talked about on the podcast basically, how it is to live out there, and he loves it. You have to take your trash out to the dump. All sorts of things that are different about living there, but he wouldn't change it, for the world, to raise the big bucks out there that he does and go hunting at deer season and things like that. But this is about Ric Flair. It's hard to talk about Ric Flair's, illustrious, huge career in an hour, but they found a way to do it. Of course, they didn't talk about TNA, but basically, they talk about, Ric Flair being a black market baby. Ric Flair was stolen from his original family, his mother and father, and somehow he ended up living with who became his mother and father. He says he doesn't have a care in the world. He's the only person that could unlock the vault to find out who his real parents were, if anybody does know. And he just said that he doesn't care. He lived his whole life with his mom and dad. They're the ones who raised him, and they're the ones that he wants to give the credit to. And he was, a great. They were great parents, and that's what got him there. Ric Flair talks about what got him into the wrestling business, and that was Verne Gagne. And the part of the story that I didn't know was the world's strongest man, Ken Patera. Ken Patera was being backed into the Olympics by Verne Gagne. Verne Gagne saw that if he became this Olympic hero by winning a gold medal, he'd be able to come back and people would know his name and have recognition from the Olympics, and he can get into the wrestling business and people would want to go out and see the world's strongest man. So Verne Gagne was backing this man who would go on to the Olympics, and once he was done, brought out to Verne Gagne's ranch and trained to be a professional wrestler. Ric Flair, who was friends with Verne Gagne at the time, basically started training, and after the first day, he did, I believe he said 500 squats and 250 push-ups. It took Ric Flair, hours to complete this, and Rick says he doesn't even know if he really did complete it, but he quit on his first day of training, a lot like a lot of other guys have done in the past. Ric Flair said, I know this isn't wrestling. I don't know what that is, but it's not wrestling, and I don't want to do it. But basically, Verne Gagne came to Rick, slapped him across the face, and he said, you quit on high school, you quit on your life, you're not quitting on this. And who knows what would have happened if Ric Flair never would have gone back and Verne Gagne wouldn't have dragged him. Oh, I apologize. If Ken Patera hadn't have dragged him back out to the ranch that day to get back to training, what would have came of the wrestling business and everything that would have come to it. Ric Flair talks about getting into the wrestling business and basically not being the Ric Flair with the robes and everything, thinking that you would want to be. Ric Flair really wanted to be Dusty Rhodes, and if you find early pictures of Ric Flair as a rookie in professional wrestling, he was wearing tie-dye, and it was basically just being told that you need to find something else. Find something that's your own in order to become the Ric Flair with the robes that we know of as today. Ric Flair was involved in a plane crash with a promoter and three wrestlers. He talked about the story of being in the plane crash. He said that when the plane hit the ground, it was going 250 miles an hour. They can tell That's how fast it was going on impact, because of the fact that the speedometer was stuck from the impact. One of the wrestlers, which was taller, he had to sit in the front of the plane, and when they pulled him out of the plane, he was all stuck up into the dash because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And they had to pull him out of there. Ric Flair talks about the fact on the way to the hospital, he heard, one of the people in the ambulance say that, hurry up, we need to get there or we're going to lose this one. They weren't talking about Ric Flair, but they were talking about one of the other wrestlers. But Ric Flair thought they were talking about him, and he told the guy, hey, you need to go into my shaving kit. In the shaving kit, you'll find a letter, and you need to get rid of that letter because his wife couldn't find it. And Ric Flair says that it was years later down the road when he would be involved in WCW. Somebody came to his hotel and knocked on the door, and when he answered the door, Ric Flair was handed the letter, and I believe he was saying the letter was written by a girl named Sheila, who was saying that she was in love with him, and if Ric's wife would have found that letter, it would have been trouble for everyone that was involved. Ric Flair tried to talk about the woo, and basically he just said that the woo came from him just finding himself and finding himself into the personality. He found a girl, I believe she was in Kansas City, who made the robes, and she promised to be able to make him something that stood out and was more special than what anybody else was wearing at the time. And that's when they started getting with the sequins and the feathers and started adding on it and becoming more and more and more, bigger and bigger, to the point where he said he was paying like $40,000 a robe, which is just bananas. But everybody can remember those star-studded robes from I remember the white and black, or maybe it's gray and black robe. There's the green one with the yellow trim. Everybody has their favorite Ric Flair one, and I'm sure that there's a Ric Flair figure up there, one of the WWE elites. I'm sure that that he's probably had hundreds of figures just based on robes alone, and it's pretty smart on why a guy would always be changing up on his look. But he said that when he was on WWE Atlanta TV, he was buying his suits and he's buying his shirts, and he wanted to make sure that when he bought these, he never would be seen twice on television wearing the same thing because he wanted it to be set up a little bit different than what everybody else was doing. Ric Flair talks about the fact that what really put him on the map was having the big series of matches with Dusty Rhodes. Dusty Rhodes, of course, was the promoter, and they had more of a rivalry that was just involved with wrestling. Basically they always tried to one-up each other. Rick tells a story about being in Kansas City for the NWA convention, and it being 90 degrees during the summer, and Ric Flair went into a fur shop and got a fur coat, and basically Dusty said, hey, where'd you get that? Dusty walked in, he bought himself a coat, basically, and then, maybe it started the other way around, because Ric Flair's wife was the one who put the topper on it, but basically, it ends up being like, he bought a robe, it was nice, they bought a nicer robe, she bought a nicer robe, and it just goes on, and Rick says, I bought a Mercedes, he bought a bigger Mercedes, I bought a house, he bought a bigger house, always trying to one-up each other. Ric Flair tells a story about, basically when he was a kid and he didn't really have anything to do, that he was just bouncing at a bar. He said basically from being in this job, everybody in town, you should start selling life insurance. And Rick started selling life insurance to all of his friends in town, and he started really making money. And that's really what he bases his life around, is the point of he never really found what a budget is. And so it's just money comes, money goes, and it's in and out. And, that's just the way he's always lived his life. And I think that's what people will always remember him for. I said that they tried to talk about his whole career in a matter of an hour, but we skip all the way from Dusty Rhodes in the early parts of the NWA to getting all the way to WrestleMania 24, possibly one of the biggest moments of being in the WWE. Ric Flair says that Vince McMahon is possibly one of the nicest guys that he's ever known. He talks about the fact that Vince once loaned him, around the time of WrestleMania 24 when he was going through a bad divorce, $800,000. He got his largest check ever from wrestling, and basically it was for WrestleMania 24, the Hall of Fame, the WrestleMania itself, and Monday Night Raw and everything, and even though it was the largest check he ever got, basically he just signed the back, and handed it over to Vince and said, "Here you go. Here's your money back." He didn't say how much it was. I don't know if it was for 800 grand or if it just ate a chunk of the loan or whatever it was. But he always remembers that, and we'll always remember the match against Shawn. He said that Shawn called everything, just told Ric to shut up. And basically, Ric says that Shawn went out there and wrestled himself, and he's just grateful that it was possibly one of the greatest matches that he was ever in. He was so devastated the next day when he woke up on a Tuesday and he was no longer in the wrestling business. Steve Austin brought up the fact that Ric Flair, he said that Ric Flair was possibly devastated the moment he took the super kick, because he basically takes the kick and sells it by falling down, and he's already started crying before the 1, 2, 3 and everything like that. I don't know if it was the thank you Shawn bring up talking about Charlotte and her being inside of WWE, which he gave a lot of thanks to Triple H being sort of like that fatherly figure, that he knew that it was going to be tough for Ashley, his daughter, who would become Charlotte, but basically Triple H, as his best friend in the world, he knew that nothing was ever going to come bad to her, because Triple H would protect her. He knew that she was a better athlete than she ever. I'm sorry. He knew that she was a better athlete than he ever was. So he's always gone over, thinking that she was going to be one of the greatest. But a great sit-down interview. Just basically, it was almost like being a fly on the wall. Austin had a piece of paper. He had some notes, what was going to lead his discussion. But even though it wasn't live and they put little cut-ins of Ric Flair's greatest sayings, I thought this was great. I would definitely put it as one I would recommend to everybody to go out of your way to really watch this. Ric Flair on Stone Cold Steve Austin's podcast. Gonna be one of the best ones. And he ends the show with talking about renting out the penthouse suite at Caesar's Palace and calling up for some hookers. So a great time had by all. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you guys down the road.